Hey guys, good afternoon. So today we're doing a sort of joint thing. I'm going to demonstrate some watercolor techniques and hopefully explain them as I go, but I'm also field testing Cottonwood Art's laminated cold press sheets. These are boards, sort of like Canton's art boards. And I have never painted on these before, so, we'll find out together how well they work. I have already drawn and inked my illustration, and if you want to follow along at home, you can go check out my Gumroad to download the line art for this. So let's get started. You're going to need your watercolor pans or paints. Of course, I'm going to go grab mine in a few minutes. A weld palette, some clean water, preferably 2 cups, but if you only have room, 1. Your brushes, some paper towels, and probably an eyedropper. For this illustration, we're going to start with a wash. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in as much as I can. This may be the last video with my janky hot mess watercolor setup. And for this, I want sort of like a nice brownish tone going on, since it was inspired by this photo of a button bouquet that I found on Pinterest. So we're going to begin by mixing up a wash of yellow ochre. And if you want to go ahead and drop some water into the pigments you're going to be using, that will help activate them, get them prepared for painting, make it a little bit easier for you to mix colors. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, if we were using a larger piece of paper, we could do our wash with a traditional mop. But since we're sort of limited on space, I think I'm going to use a synthetic flat. I just have to find it. All right, so we're going to take our flat and our pre-mixed wash. Of course, some Brusho crystals got on this. When doesn't Brusho invade my life? Now, since this is on watercolor board, we shouldn't need to stretch it. So I'm just progressing on with the wash. And you're going to want to absorb any excess watercolor from the surface so it doesn't pool. And you can do that pretty simply by running a dry or thirsty brush, not entirely dry, it should be pre-moistened, but most of the water dabbed out of it, across any areas where your color seems to have pooled. All right, so our paper isn't entirely dry. It is still cool to the touch. I noticed a very slight bowing to it. It could be the fact that it is such a small piece of laminated watercolor paper. Maybe larger pieces can handle the additional water a little bit better. I do want to darken up my certain areas of my wash a little bit, and I'm just going to use a round since I'm working in pretty tight spaces. And we will be painting over it, but if you don't want a harsh line, you can use some clean water to go ahead and blend it out. And this paper seems to be taking that all right. There's some papers that absorb, like Global Arts watercolor paper, and I have a review of that forthcoming. It absorbs the paint or the water so quickly that you can't do any blending on it. And it is a cold press paper. Now, that is pretty common for hot press papers. So that is something to keep in mind when you are selecting a paper finish. Personally, I prefer cold press or hot rough press. I find they are not only the most forgiving, but the most enjoyable to paint on. And I talk about the differences in paper finishes, as well as how you can select a watercolor paper that's appropriate for your needs. In a few different posts, I go over the different paper types in detail in the Watercolor Basics terms you should know, and I'll link that right here. I guess y'all can see that. And I go over selecting a paper in Watercolor Basics. It's all about the paper. And I'll link that right here as well. So hopefully that'll help you guys find a paper that is suitable for your project. I do have some experience with fine art watercolors, at least for studies and such. But most of what I do is geared towards illustration and comics. So much of what my advice is also applicable to crafters. So far, although this paper isn't as textured as an Arches or a Monderoy, it does do a good job of allowing me to continue to work the paints after they've been put down, staying moist, retaining the moisture so that paints are still workable and blendable without requiring much scrubbing. All right, so we're going to go ahead and allow this to dry. So I will be back soon. While we wait for this to dry, we're gonna go ahead and mix up our skin tone. And for many Caucasian skin tones, especially Cara skin, I usually do a mixture of yellow ochre with some scarlet. So you get like this nice sort of pinky tone. Maybe add a little more yellow ochre. And in general, you do want to swatch. And I'm also going to go ahead and activate the color of her dress. Now, since I want a lot of this to be brown, I think I want her dress to actually be an indigo color. I think that would contrast really well, especially because her hair is brown. And I also thought for the stems, I would use or start out at least with a Winsor Newton's green gold, which is one of my favorite colors. I've been told I have weird taste when it comes to colors. I think a lot of people would call it like a pukey green, but I think it's beautiful because as you apply layers, it gets richer and richer, and it goes from like a very fresh yellow green, more yellow than green, to a darker yellow green. My favorite colors are the ones that sort of shift dramatically as you add more pigment. So I also really love Indian yellow and gamboge yellow. And just go ahead and pre-mix some of my other colors. And it really helps to have 2 cups of water. For space reasons, I only have 1. I'm gonna have to go dump this in a few minutes. It really helps to have 2 cups of water, a clean cup and a dirty cup. So when you wanna rinse your brush off, you use your dirty cup, and when you wanna fill wells, you use your clean cup. Unfortunately, my space is limited enough that is not really an option. Okay, so our background has, for the most part, dried. It's dried enough that we can apply some color. And I know that on the blog, I do talk about paintbrushes, and I have a video over here where I also discuss some of my favorite paintbrushes. But you know, for people like me, it is helpful to see this sort of stuff in action. So I'm going to start out with one of my favorites. It is a Blick Master. It is a squirrel brush. It is not the highest quality brush, but it is great for fills, and it still holds a pretty good point, even though my cat has chewed on it many times over the years. And I'm just going to go ahead and simply fill in her skin. I'm going one of the nice things about this terrible camera setup is it's sort of forcing me to think about my shots. So, you know, that sort of mindfulness will probably, hopefully lead to better, improved shots. We'll see. Anyway, for the most part, most of the painting I do is with rounds, and that's just personal preference. I do have a lot of other brushes, but they always seem to sit in the case. I don't seem to grab for them. Now, I probably should, you know, make it a point in some of my studies to actively use some of these, some of the brushes that I wouldn't normally go for. But if you are looking to start a watercolor collection, and you have limited funds, your money is well spent picking up rounds and a couple flats. Okay, so I think you guys know how the drill goes. Gotta let that dry. All right, so our first layer of skin is dry, and now I'm gonna take just the littlest bit of scarlet and add a lot of water to it so I can start applying a blush. Now, usually I'll use like Alzerian Crimson mixed with like a cadmium orange for blush, but that's in my other set. And I think we'll be okay with this anyway. So, if you make a mistake, you can use your paper towel to go ahead and absorb that, so long as it's wet. And you can also use your brush, most of the water dabbed out, to go ahead and blend out any mistakes that you've made. And when I apply blush with my brush, I like to apply it. Give me a second, let me apply it and then I'll go over it. I like to apply it across the cheeks and the bridge of the nose, often underneath the nose, under the lips, above the eyes, where the joints on your fingers are, and in, you're not gonna be able to see it, the crook of your elbow on the inside, and pretty much anywhere where skin is going to meet other skin. So now that we've got a layer of blush down, it's time to start working on darkening up the skin. And you may need to mix it darker if you didn't mix it dark enough initially. And if you find your brush is putting down too much paint, you can just go ahead and daub some of that off on your handy paper towel. On the face, areas that I always darken first are from the bridge of the nose on up to the forehead, especially on sort of child characters like Kara here. It sort of gives this illusion of like very round features. I'm going to need to mix my skin tone darker. So with that, you need to let this layer dry and go ahead and mix a little darker. And this is where having a swatch would be super handy, because that way you can match your color. You don't want it to be too red or too yellow ochre-y, because then it's gonna really stand out and it's not gonna look as natural. And even though our content matter is cartoony, it doesn't mean we aren't going for an illusion of life. So that layer's dry. We're gonna go ahead and test out the new skin tone. And I am also noticing that this laminated watercolor sheet is starting to warp upwards, which is sort of counterintuitive, considering it is a laminated watercolor sheet. I picked this up at David Art Supply when I was in town for MechaCon. I think my regular readers know I do have a bit of a problem with compulsively acquiring more and more things to review. Alright, that does seem dark enough, albeit a bit pink, so we're gonna let it dry. So that is mostly dry. We're gonna go ahead and fill in her dress. using a smaller round this time, another favorite. This is the Creative Mark Rhapsody. They are available through Jerry's Artorama. This one has been chewed up a little bit, so it's lost its lovely fine point, unfortunately. And right now, I'm just sort of filling in the space, almost like you would with a coloring book. I'm just trying to get a flat layer of color so I can begin building my shadows and highlights. Again, if you happen to go over the line, you can just soak it up with a piece of paper towel. I like to tear them up a little bit into, you know, smaller pieces that are easier to handle for those teeny tiny areas. And if you're working with beaten up, chewed up brushes like I am, unfortunately, right now, you really want to think about it more as guiding your color around, since the brush will sort of lack the snap. And once you've used a nicer brush, or a brush that's better taken care of, or a brush that's been conditioned recently, which is I think the problem with this one is it needs some TLC, you will be able to tell the difference. Now, for the whites of her eyes, we can add some water to the indigo that was in the brush. And I like to, let's see if I can get really in there. All right, I like to do the top half of the eyes. And let's go ahead and get the teeth. All right, now that that layer's dried, I actually want to darken it just the littlest bit. Hopefully I can do that without going overboard by adding just a little bit more indigo to the mix. And then I could let it dry like that because it'll dry lighter. In fact, I might just do that. So let's see. Let's zoom out a little bit and keep working on her dress. I'll switch brushes to a different round. And this board is buckling a bit, which is making it a little difficult to work with. The paper surface is fine though. At least I haven't encountered any problems, but I mean, we're still in the very early stages of this, so we'll see. And the technique I use for most of my painting, including what I'm doing right now, is basically just glazing. It's when you're applying many thin layers of color or pigment, one on top of the other, to build up your forms. All right, so now that this is mostly dry, it is a little still cool to the touch, but it shouldn't reactivate. We're going to go ahead and start filling in her hair. And if you're working at a smaller size and you're able to move your canvas around, feel free to do so. And since this is a very light wash, I'm just going to go ahead and fill in all of her hair, and I'll worry about adding details later on. Alright, so while her hair dries, we're going to go ahead and start some of these buttons since there's so many of them. And I wanted to begin with a nice sunny yellow ochre button, or two. Now, yellow ochre goes down sort of opaque, especially if you've activated it. So you may want to see how it's sort of opaque there at the top. You may want to remove some of the pigment, and that'll give you room to build up color and will also help prevent it from becoming chalky. For my card makers out there, I think this image would make a really sweet postcard. And on the sort of heavier like watercolor cards. Maybe not this one since it is kipping so much. It just seems like an ideal sort of one-sided postcard thing, and that might be completely antithetical to what you guys, what like the whole point of making cards, because I don't know that I've seen too many card makers do postcards, but I think it would be a really sweet little image, very reminiscent of Hobby Holly. And since there is so much detail, there's a lot of room for you to put your own personality into it and make it more personal. And it's also a good opportunity to get to know your watercolors. I mean, you could make every button in the bouquet a different color, so it'd be a very vibrant, colorful piece. And it would give you a chance to play around with everything and become more familiar with what you have in your palette. Of course, I am horrifically biased because I am the creator of this image. So, you know, of course I would love to see other people's take on it. And of course, purchases like that do help fund videos like this. I'm pretty much playing with all the browns I have in my palette. And this is a personal palette. I guess you guys can't see it. You've seen it in other videos though. It is a personal palette that I have assembled based on my preferences and based on the needs of my current long form project, which is a all ages watercolor comic, 7-inch Kara. And you know, initially I wanted to make a children's comic, and that's what Kara really is, but a lot of my customers are teenagers and there are adults who enjoy it as well. So sort of think of it like a Ghibli film. This is the sort of thing that the whole family should be able to enjoy. And it follows the adventures of Kara here. She's a 7-inch tall little girl exploring the big outside world around her. And it sort of came from some of my frustrations with children's comics. I did my thesis on panel layout and how that affects reading comprehension. And I found that many children's comics for younger kids, so there are children's books like Alice in Wonderland or Chronicles of Narnia that are clearly written to be enjoyed over a long span of time. There's a lot that you can go back to. So when I was a child, my mom used to read those sort of books to me, like The Secret Garden and Grimm's Fairy Tales. Now, I could not have read those books on my own, but it fueled a deep love for those sort of books. And I'd go back to them year after year when I could read on my own. So I wanted to make the sort of comics that a parent and a child could read together, and there would be things for both of them to enjoy. And I also wanted to make a comic. A lot of children's comics are just very sparsely drawn with very sort of plain faces. And I do understand from a comic craft level that the more simplistically you draw the face, the quicker it is for it to parse. And that's useful for small children. But I thought, well, why not have a slightly more complicated style? Nothing too complicated, nothing hard to read, but something that they could enjoy for several years. And I was also very frustrated because many of the fiction comics for kids featured only male protagonists. And, when I was a little girl, there weren't really comics for me. You know, there was Archie, which revolves around Archie, and there were Marvel and DC titles that, while they might have female characters, never really felt like they were written for a child to enjoy, let alone a little girl. So I wanted to fill that gap. And the first volume is out. I sell it at conventions, all sorts of conventions, from anime to indie cons. It's also available in my shop in a physical form at natosoup.com/Kara-comic, and a digital form for your tablet at my Gumroad, which is like gumroad.com/natosoup. I'll post links to those things in in the annotations. Anyway, I draw her a lot. Partially because when I did volume 1, when I was ready to put it together into a book, even though I had a lot of art assets, I realized I needed a lot more. So I figured, you know, while I'm doing tutorials and stuff, why not make those assets that I could use later? So that's why you guys see so much of Kara. And since Naomi has been introduced and is starting to play a larger role, Naomi is the friend, the human girl that Kara meets, you're going to start seeing more of her as well. So I'm going to let this layer dry since the buttons are kind of all over the place, and we'll pick up from there. Alright guys, those buttons are dry. We have a couple of options. We can go ahead and work on adding some more detail to the hair. And this brush, it's still a round, but it is a round that has longer bristles. Let's see if I can get it to where y'all can see it. Is ideal for hair because there is lots of, you know, give and flick and flex, so you can get really nice highlights. I am going to need to go back in and darken her skin underneath where her hair is, and I definitely need to add another layer on her arms and her neck. Now you want to make sure you stir your watercolors every now and then. You guys can't see it, but I just stirred my skin tone because some of the pigments will settle out, and then you want to rinse your brush off and then re-dip it, and that way you're not getting all of the sediment attached, and that's just useful for, you know, color consistency. In the book, I try to be pretty consistent with specific color palettes. So with Kara, it's a lot of natural colors, so she doesn't wear like bright pink or anything like that. It would be the sort of dyes or staining you could get from, you know, plant matter or using like earth pigments, that kind of thing. Naomi wears synthetic colors because she's a human and has access to that sort of stuff. So after Kara and Naomi start spending time together, I am going to shift Kara's wardrobe to be a little more inclusive of those sort of pigments, just to sort of reflect their relationship and Naomi's views sort of being introduced to Kara. And at that point, I get to deal with sort of Kara becoming her own person. I mean, she's already her own person, but sometimes you don't realize who you are until you have a friend who challenges your beliefs, and they might not even be in the wrong. It just might not be right for you. And I thought it was important to do a girl's coming of age story and a story about female friendship where there's no fighting over boys, there's no actual, I mean, there's conflict, but there's no fighting of that sort, and there's not any violence of that sort. I just wanted to tell a very specific type of story because there aren't a lot of things out there like that for kids, let alone for little girls. There's really not a lot out there for little girls. And if you like comics or you like my art style, it's definitely worth checking out. You know, since it is drawn and written by me, it's full of that kind of stuff. And so I did promise you guys we would talk techniques. I am doing wet over dry, and it is not quite glazing because I am working directly from the pan, so my paints are mixed a lot thicker. And if the paper weren't kipped so much, now would be a fun time to introduce things like salt to add some variation. The problem is when the paper is as buckled as this is, the salt's just all going to sort of head off to the middle of the page. So it's just not really an ideal situation. And the more you paint, the more you'll be able to spot problems like that ahead of time. So the more you can sort of head them off at the pass, which is why in the Watercolor Basics series, I do encourage you guys to do a lot of practice. When I started Kara, I painted like here and there, but it was sort of like one-off things as just part of my general art school education sort of thing. It wasn't anything serious. None of the schools I went to had any sort of a painting focus. So a lot of what I picked up, I just sort of picked up as I went along or through reading stuff on the internet or watching videos. So, you know, kind of like what a lot of you guys are doing. We have very similar backgrounds. And my intention wasn't to... What Kara became for me as my skills improved is not quite what it started out as. In the beginning, I was just using watercolor as a way to add color because I know that for children's comics, color is much more engaging than black and white. And I wanted to create a world for people to sort of escape into if they wanted to. I wanted, when people read my comics, I want them to, and my goal, it doesn't always happen, is I want them to leave feeling richer than when they went in. Sort of, again, like when you watch a Ghibli movie, you feel like you've been given something. You know, there's so many movies and TV shows where it feels like they took something away from you. You leave wrecked and kind of hopeless and maybe even disliking other people for a while. You know, that's how I feel. Cynical. You leave feeling cynical. And I wanted people to read my comics and feel hopeful, optimistic, to feel like somebody out there cares about them and just wants to make them happy. So, as time went on, I improved with watercolors. I spent more and more time working on Kara pages, and more dedication went into it, you know, really trying to hone my craft. So now I would say my goal is to make beautiful illustrated comics, because that's just not necessarily a thing over here in the States. You know, it's not, there isn't a Caldecott Award for children's comics. There's the Ignats, and they do have a children's section, I believe, and there's the Eisners, and I think they might have a kids section, but most comics, kids comics are kind of seen as secondary or lesser, and doing kids comics, I think it's actually very challenging to do a comic that is satisfying for a kid to read, that they can follow, but that an adult will also enjoy. So that is my goal. And I mean, people point out, oh, well, what about things like Bone, which is, you know, clearly great. Well, you know, Bone wasn't intended to be a children's comic. It's great that it works on that level, and that, you know, there are kid readers who have derived much satisfaction from it. But I wanted to create something good from the start that was intended for younger readers. Sorry, it's sort of like my late mid-year resolution to talk more about the things I love and the reason why I do what I do. Since I feel like you guys don't necessarily know me too well unless we talk on Twitter. So, I'm going to lift up some of the areas of her skin, just sort of gently. Also, a couple of you have been very generous in telling me that what I do, what I talk about, when I talk about these sort of things, which are very personal, to the point where I'm almost embarrassed because I feel like I'm shilling, so I don't talk about the things I love, but I'm gonna change that. Some of you have been very kind and very generous and have told me that you enjoy it when I talk about these things, and it makes you want to work on your projects, and that just means the world to me when you guys tell me those things, like, because I get a lot more negative responses than I do positive responses. And there are a lot of times where I just want to quit sharing this stuff with you guys. So when you guys tell me something like that, it gives me the motivation to keep putting these things out. I know, not talking about watercolor, Becca. Sorry. I did think it was relevant since a lot of the people who are going to be watching this are my regular viewers. I just wanted to thank you very sincerely for being kind to me in that regard, because there are a lot more people who just swing in, see one thing, happen not to like it, say something really nasty and leave. and that just really takes it out of me. I found a couple of buttons that I missed and also decided on a color for one of them. Sometimes when I enter with just a rough color palette in my head, I sort of find my palette as I'm painting. I don't always recommend, I really don't recommend that if you're just getting started. Even just make swatches, just have a roadmap. It'll help you out a lot. But once you've been painting a while and you're familiar with your palette, it's okay to sort of play it by ear. And I have found that when I'm sort of winging it, sticking to a limited palette makes it seem like you know what you're doing and you had a very clear vision. See, when I was younger, my idea of a palette is all of the pastels together. That's not a palette. A palette would be, okay, so very, very basic color theory here because it is not necessarily my strong point in explaining it. Orange and blue are complementary colors. Browns and yellow ochres sort of fall into the orange family. They're orange influenced, so they look really nice with blues, especially a greenish tint blue like the indigo that I currently have. Winsor Newton's half pan watercolor is a very greenish blue indigo. Whereas Holbein's neutral tint is actually a very gorgeous sort of a purple indigo. Works for just about everything. So this is basically my color scheme is blue and orange influenced colors. And I'm just sticking to that for the most part. I mean, her skin is peachy, so, you know, that sort of falls within that orange as well. And when you're working at a very small size, it does help to limit your color palette because it can get kind of overwhelming. So I'm going to apply her freckles, and I have this teeny tiny Creative Mark Rhapsody. It is, I think, a 0. It could be a 00. It's a 1, wow. And I usually apply a couple of layers, and I'll try to zoom in for you guys so you guys can really see it. So I apply a base layer of freckles, which is just very light, because those of you who have freckles of your own, you know that some of them have faded over time and some of them are very new. So I think it helps build up an attractive depth for freckles. And I also try to just do little oblongs because that's the shape my freckles are in. Freckles are not perfectly round. I mean, if that's like a stylistic decision you're making, that's one thing. That's an active choice on your part, but do try to make them sort of oblong and irregularly patterned, and that'll make them look a little more realistic. So that, oh, there we go. That's our first layer. Now, as these dry, some are gonna dry lighter, and I'm gonna go ahead when they're dry and do another layer of freckles. And I'm gonna go refresh my water, and we can talk about mixing shadow tones. All right, guys, so now we're going to mix our shadow tint, and I've been away for a little while, so I do need to reactivate my pigments. And when I mix shadows, especially for like lighter or Caucasian skin, I like to go with more of a red base. So while those are activating, I'll go ahead and apply a little more blush. And I went ahead and changed out my water. And you guys can see that my laminated watercolor sheet has buckled, which is not a good thing. Not supposed to happen. Definitely makes it a little more difficult to work with. Now, before that dries into a harsh line, we're going to go ahead and add some water, sort of blend it out a little bit. And while that dries, we'll go ahead and begin mixing the shadow color for skin. So this is some Naphthol Red from Daniel Smith. You can also use a nice red violet. This is, I think it's Permanent Mauve by Soho, and it is kind of a color, a fugitive color. And then just a little bit of purple in there. All right, so we, first of all, so the indigo on her hair bow is a little more intense than I would like, so we're gonna blend that out. And that's one of the nice things about watercolor is you can often reactivate it and lift it out a bit. So we've applied water all over. Now we need to take some paper towel and see, let me see if I can zoom way in. If you don't use a clean piece, you'll end up printing your paint onto an area adjacent. Now you can try to lift that off. It might make it worse. So you're sort of stuck with how you're gonna resolve it. If you choose to resolve it, I mean, some people opt to leave it. I'm gonna try to lift it. Sometimes when you do it, it makes it worse. So, you know, it's always sort of a little debate as to how you want to handle that sort of thing. All right, so we talked about skin and shadow on skin. Going back to that 0.1 Creative Mark Rhapsody, since this is such a little illustration, we're going to mix up some of that shadow color we just talked about. And this might not be dark enough, we'll find out. So since her arms are pretty much entirely in shadow, I filled them in all the way. Her neck is going to be the same thing. And her face is going to mostly be where the bangs are. All right, so the first shadow layer, or layer of shading, has dried. It gives me sort of an idea of what to work with, what to darken up. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little more shadow where her hair covers her face, because that would be a cast shadow. But otherwise, I'm pretty satisfied with that. Also going to go back in on the buttons and continue working on shading those. You guys can see that I am having a little bit of trouble given how much this paper has warped, because I do like to rest my hand on the paper as I work, and the fact that it's kipping up this way makes it sort of difficult to work with because it wants to teeter a whole lot. The quality of the paper actually used on the watercolor board is all right. I have a feeling though it's a thinner watercolor paper, like a 90 pound rather than, oh, maybe not, I could be wrong. Maybe it's 140. But whatever they're doing, it is not working as well as I would like. Now, am I unreasonable for expecting it to remain completely flat? Maybe so. I've worked with Canson's Montval art board in the past, and I did not have buckling problems. It is a thicker art board, so maybe my expectations are just unreasonable. This is a thinner art board, so, you know, maybe that's why it's kipping, and maybe it doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the chipboard. But the reason people buy this sort of product is, you know, to prevent that sort of buckling that we're getting here. So I feel like my expectation is not that unreasonable. Now, You might be able to get this to flatten out completely after you finish painting if you put it under a heavy stack of books. For me though, the big concern is not buckling after the piece is finished, although, you know, that doesn't really look very professional, but rather buckling while I'm trying to paint it and trying to do details. I'm using Winsor & Newton's green gold to go ahead and fill in the stalks. Now you see, oh, there we go. I went and got a big glob, and it's way too big to fill in these teeny tiny little stalks. So what I'm gonna do is find an empty well on my palette and just go ahead and squeegee some of that off. If I had gone ahead and put it on the paper, it would have made a big mess. It would have been difficult to control, and I probably would have ended up having to correct it. You could also dab off excess like that onto your paper towel, but if you're going to want to continue using it, squeegeeing it off into an empty well is also a good idea. For me, the sort of intricate filling in work is not a problem at all with watercolor. I enjoy painting this sort of stuff. I don't always enjoy drawing it. The problem is basically just waiting for paint to dry. And in prior videos, I've suggested that the way I handle this is I work on several pieces at one time, or if I'm recording, I pause it and I work on writing a blog post. I basically just do something else while I'm also doing this. Just to sort of, so I'm not just like sitting here watching paint actually dry. I do know many of the people I've talked to who've told me they would be interested in learning how to watercolor, but haven't for whatever reason. Most of them give that whatever reason as because they're too impatient. And I guess I'd always assumed it was the impatience of watching paint dry, but it might actually be the impatience of, you know, at least with the way I would do watercolors, is you guys have noticed it's very many transparent thin layers. It takes a fair amount of time. If that's the case, there are other methods to watercolor painting. You don't have to do it exactly the way I do. There are many, many other artists who share their art and craft on YouTube and through blogs and on Tumblr. So you may find someone else whose work speaks to you more than mine does. And when it comes to linking, with YouTube, I pretty much only link other artists whose work I'm citing directly, or you know, if somebody's work inspired me greatly, inspired a particular piece, I'll link it so you guys can see that. But on the blog, I try to link as many relevant things as possible. Sorry, I realized I got off camera a little bit. So if you're looking for outside inspiration, you may be able to find what you're looking for by checking out my second opinions and resources section at the end of my watercolor basics blog posts. I mean, style is really just absorbing what you like from other artists and making it your own. I also recommend that you do studies mimicking other people, like to figure out other people's styles. So you might draw something of your own and try to mimic someone else's style of rendering. And you can even mimic digital art or, you know, other media, because you might end up finding a technique that you wouldn't have otherwise tried that you really enjoy in watercolor. For me, directly mimicking other people's styles when it comes to color is something I should do more often. That would be called like a master study. This is a practice that is been done for hundreds of years. More art schools should champion it because it does teach stronger skills. You know, that sort of stuff has gotten a bad rap. So long as you're not passing it off as all your own, as long as you You give credit to the artist who's inspired you. It's perfectly fine to do studies like that. It's a good practice. It's healthy for your art. You know, it's like taking your art vitamins. I do style tests all the time when it comes to drawing. And blog readers, or people who bought last year's sketchbook, my 2015 sketchbook, there are pages and pages and pages of ink style tests. But when it comes to color, because color is so time consuming, I don't always do as many style tests as I should. And while working on this watercolor basic series, I have been trying to study and bring to you guys alternative methods of watercolor. Of course, those are the methods that appeal to me and also are in line with the sort of work I create. So that's still very limited. So I encourage you guys to seek inspiration elsewhere. And if you guys find an artist whose work really speaks to you, maybe share it to the channel so that other people can see it. I know many of you who watch these videos are doing so because you're either not yet in college or you can't afford to go to art school. You're just trying to supplement as much as possible. A big part of why people go to art schools, if they're being honest with themselves, is for the community. So let's emulate that aspect here as much as possible. All right, so I've got all of the stalks done. And I was thinking, while I was doing that, I was thinking about, what colors I wanted to make other things. So we're going to go ahead and fill in her apron. And we're doing a flat sort of fill using a squirrel brush. Now, squirrel brushes can hold a lot of water. They can lay down a lot of water too. So if you're having trouble rendering because, you're just laying down too much water at any given time, squirrel might be the problem. If you're having a problem with new layers scraping away old or removing prior layers of color, and you're using synthetics, your synthetics may be too stiff. So you might want to switch over to natural fibers. Another suggestion, if you're a coffee fiend like me, painting after you've had a coffee and you're hungry, you may end up with handshakes, which are no good. In fact, my hands are telling me it's dinner time because my stomach is rumbling and my hands are shaking, and that's a bad combination. So this green I'm using, this beautiful olive green, is or green gold, is a very yellow green, maybe even hints of brown in it. And I feel like it goes with the color scheme. Now, this color scheme, many of you are probably thinking about how dated it looks like. It looks like grandma's couch from the 70s. Well, the inspiration is from the 70s, so it is that sort of a color palette. And I really enjoy these kind of color palettes in addition to softer pastel like pinks and such. All right, so I'm going to let this dry and I'll check back in with you guys. All right, so now that that's dried, I'm gonna go directly into Indian red. And Indian red, when it's thickly mixed, tends to be kind of opaque. So if you are using Indian red at full strength, the way I'm using it right now, you kind of want to save it until near the end, because if you do a glaze over it, it's going to make your piece look very muddy. And this is true for any of the sort of opaque or chalkier colors. So a lot of the natural earth pigments, this is going to be a problem for. It's just something to keep in mind. Gosh, my brain wanted to combine like 4 different little turns of phrase. It's frustrating and it happens pretty frequently. So like your yellow ochres are also going to be colors that can get muddy if you try to do glazes over them. So you either want to limit your glazes or apply colors like that towards the end where there won't be many colors going over them. If you are unsure which colors are going to go down opaque or transparent, Watercolor Misfit, and you can find a link to her channel right here in the annotations. Watercolor Misfit has several watercolor exercises to help you become familiar with your palette. And I think I actually have the book. I think it's like Watercolor Essentials, where it seems like she got a lot of those exercises from. So if you work better following along in a book than following along in a video, you might want to pick up Watercolor Essentials. And one of these days, I either need to do a blog post or a video because there's so many watercolor books on the market. In fact, Mind of Watercolor, and you can find a link to his channel right here in the annotations. He did a very excellent video on which watercolor books are worth your time and money and which ones are not. Because there are a lot of those kinds of books out on the market. A lot of them rehash the same information, or they just don't cover anything. They spend the entire time helping you put together your palette and no time with any sort of real drawing instruction, or the only instruction they provide is basically copy this illustration step by step, do it exactly like we do. And while that, again, the master study can be very valuable, and it's great if you want to, you know, if all you ever want to do is make pieces that, you know, are attractive and you can put them up in your home, but there's no original thought, that's not important to you, the originality. Those kind of books are great, and those exercises do have value. I'm not dismissing them, but I know many of you want to be able to learn how to watercolor and use it to render your own original illustrations, be it from photographs or for comics. And that was definitely that is definitely the main focus of the my Watercolor Basics series, since there doesn't seem to be many other people who sort of focus on that topic. Sorry, painting and I got distracted. So hopefully I can help fill in some of the gaps, and we can get you guys painting the sort of things you want to paint, in addition to the things you know you ought to be painting. So I'm gonna let this dry. All right, guys, slowly making progress, reaching that finish line. A lot about watercolor is just, you know, being patient enough to stick with things until the end. Of course, there are special tips and techniques that can help you along the way, but patience is a big part of it. And it's the sort of thing that can't really fake the patience part. Now, not all colors have this lovely quality, but some of the yellows, some of the green golds, some of the browns do, where the more you layer them, the richer in tone they become. So you see how well green gold over here layers? And I'm also applying shadow, and I mix that using a little bit of indigo, Payne's gray, and a little bit of it's a Daniel Smith color. It's actually not that important to the mixture. What's really important is the bit of indigo and the Payne's gray. Of course, I'm having a little bit of problem with the color lifting up, so I'm going to have to put another layer on top of that. And since that mouth is a very hot pink mouth, I'm going to go back over it again with some Naphthol red. And then Hopefully I'll not live to regret this. And by that I mean I don't want to just die, but hopefully this is not a regrettable thing. I'm going to go back over where I'd added that shadow color and just sort of lightly reapply some of that yellow ochre. And the reason I'm doing that is because when I applied that shadow, it sort of wiped away some of the yellow ochre that I previously applied. So, and that can be useful sometimes because it really will give it a shaded effect. But that was not really what I was going for. We can add some Van Dyck brown to the hair though. So when I do these watercolor tutorials, I have this really bad habit of like constantly saying I'm in the home stretch. And really, that just means almost everything has been blocked in. I know for some of you guys, it's probably pretty painful because you're like, clearly there's a lot left to be done. So I am trying not to, oh shoot. Not to say that this time, because that's not doing any of us any good. And I'm just gonna focus on getting this done. And if there's anything I did in the video that you would like me to revisit at another point in time because you're having trouble with it and need a little extra help, just shoot me a message in the comment, or you can email me, or you can tweet me, whatever. And I will try to help you out, either by recording a follow-up video or by answering you directly. In the future, I would like to start doing some like micro videos over on Instagram for like really simple to demonstrate things. So maybe we'll be able to use that as one of those videos. But all of the techniques covered in this video were very straightforward, very simple techniques that didn't really require much explanation. So I think it's a good basics video. Now I have noticed that with cheaper papers, you do get color lift off. Whereas with nicer papers like Arches, you can glaze without prior colors lifting off quite so readily. That leads me to believe that the paper used in this Cottonwood Art's watercolor sheet, as they call it, is not particularly high quality watercolor paper. There was actually not much information on the package itself about it. And I haven't had a chance to do much research into the company yet. I will when I do the blog post review. But you know, you gotta have a field test, or I gotta have a field test before I do write a review. I used to just, my testing standards weren't as stringent a few years ago. And I'm glad I put most of the products that I review through actual testing, because sometimes things seem great when you're swatching them, and then as soon as you, or not as soon, but maybe things seem all right, you know, when you're only working with one or two layers, but then when you start really laying the paint down on the paper, that's when you start to notice a lot of problems. I mean, the bending, the warp we've gotten here in the paper wasn't apparent until we'd been working on this paper for a little while. Now I have a feeling this paper would warp after about 20 minutes of painting anyway. So even if you have a pretty light hand, it might not work well for you. I mean, I didn't particularly saturate the paper. Certainly not any more than I normally do, and I usually, especially if I'm working with Brusho, I usually end up with a lot more water on the paper than what we applied today. So, I guess I will not be using Cottonwood Art's laminated watercolor sheets in the future, and that's okay, because this was just something I kind of picked up on a whim. I saw it at David's Art Supply when I was in Louisiana for MechaCon, and I was like, hey, why not? Thought you guys might be interested. And I don't really play around on watercolor board very much, so it is something I could definitely you know, mess around with more, especially if it performed better than this. All right, so most of that layer has dried. And I'm just adding a little bit of olive green shadow to the bottom of each stitch on the stems, just to try and, you know, push the illusion of depth. And I may have to mix in a little bit of Hunter's Green if that doesn't really show up properly. All right, so we are going to and mixing a little bit of Hunter's Green in with the olive green or the green gold, maybe a little brown too. And of course, if you have color pencils or watercolor pencils and you're comfortable using them, now would also be a good time to add fine details with those. For watercolor comics, there's no rules saying you can't also introduce other medium. So at this stage, when I'm adding the dark shadows to her hair, I'm using a pretty thick mix of sepia. And this is basically almost a dry brush technique. It's more of like a gouache consistency than it is a watercolor consistency. Now, if it were dry brush, I would be getting a lot of the speckling, because the brush would be so dry that there wouldn't be enough liquid to go down into the, you know, the different peaks and valleys of the watercolor paper. Not that this particular paper has many of those. So it's just thick enough for heavy coverage, not so thick that it's dry. So there's one final step before we're finished. That's adding white highlights with gouache. I need to let this dry completely, but I'll check back in with you in a few minutes. All right, guys, home stretch for real. So with gouache, and I recommend you use gouache over white watercolor. Gouache is a thicker watercolor-esque product that is meant to be applied more thickly. It's intended to be opaque. So you want the sort of consistency like heavy cream. And I went ahead and applied some on my Inkessentials craft sheet. It'll wipe right up after we're done with it and I'm out of empty wells. I just mixed a little bit of water in with it as well. So you want to use your white gouache pretty much only to add highlights if you didn't leave them originally. And for the buttons, I certainly did not leave them the highlights originally. Let's see if I can get in closer for you guys. In some ways, this camera setup is nice in that my head does not block the camera, which I know is a huge problem when I'm bent over. So you really want your white highlights to be very sparse, gee whiz, combining spare and sparse. It's hard for me to explain to you why white gouache is better than, say, white watercolor. And that's because I have never found a white watercolor that I actually liked. It was never opaque enough. No matter how thick I mixed it, it would always dry translucent, which I found frustrating. I mean, what's the point if it's translucent? You know, you're going for white here. So I do recommend white gouache over white watercolor. Now, true serious business watercolor artists will either reserve through Frisket or leave through black magic. I'm just kidding. White highlights on the page. I often work so small that it's hard for me to do so. My fine motor skills are not so fine. So I find going back in with white gouache to be a very satisfactory way of adding back in white highlights. And comic artists don't really care how you get to your solution so long as you hit your solution. So, you know, whatever gives you the art that works. So I'm not really concerned with, you know, adhering to the standards of fine art watercolor artists. I've found that if you're the sort of artist or illustrator who worries too much about impressing other people or what other people think, I know, ironic, because everything we do is intended for consumption by other people, especially if you're on YouTube. But if you're that sort of artist, it will sort of prevent you from making the work you want to make. So, you know, I think it is more important, rather than adhering to convention, I think it is more important for you to make the sort of work that means something to you and that you would enjoy or is important to you. And that's what this series is about, is empowering and inspiring you guys who would like to learn watercolor for your work, for your illustration or your comics, to empower you to do so, because there aren't a lot of watercolor for comics classes out there. And you may have the same sort of experiences that I had, where when you do take a watercolor class and the teacher asks you why you're interested in learning watercolor, and you say for comics, you might get a face that looks like they've just consumed a bunch of bitter grapes. So, you know, I don't want you to think you are alone out there or that you're crazy for wanting to learn this beautiful medium for your own devices. Storytelling is an important art, and it's an art that's been around, been part of being human for thousands of years. So, you know, just because some people don't think it's important enough doesn't mean you should take that to heart. And there are plenty of people who do think it's important enough. So, we are finished with sometimes, you know, I say that and then I look at her sleeves and I'm like, I could do just a little halo, just a little bit. And you know what else? You might be tempted when people ask you why you're doing something, or what your favorite art form is, or what your end goal of learning how to draw might be. You might be tempted to lie, based on the experiences I've recounted with you guys, for fear of, you know, being treated as less or being judged. But the thing is, for as many people who have negative misconceptions about comics, there are people who are going to be excited and think what you want to do is wonderful and want to help you. And you are cheating yourself, and you're letting the people who don't understand the art form cheat you when you allow their negative opinions to scare you out of talking about what you honestly love. So I know it can be hard sometimes when your art teacher frowns upon everything you do, or, you know, you talk to a company rep at a very prestigious watercolor company and he gives you a really hard time about doing watercolor comics without ever having looked at them. I know that sort of response can be really painful, or it can just kind of make you want to not talk about what you do, or lie about what you do, or lie about what you want. But and I'm not saying turn in comic stuff for assignments that are not comics related. Do not get me wrong. I'm just saying that when you are pursuing your craft, don't let other people's negative opinions about a craft they don't understand and they don't consume dissuade you from loving it. I mean, I personally think it takes a lot of courage to do things that you love and love them honestly, and not allow other people to push you off that path. So I hope you guys are courageous. So that's the end of this video. We were taking a look at Cottonwood Art's watercolor, they call it a watercolor sheet. It's thick like a watercolor board. Unfortunately, it does bend when you add enough water. I may put this under a book and try to straighten it out because it's not going to scan very well like this. Or I guess I can just like apply gentle pressure, bending it out. For the full review, please check out my blog at natosoup.blogspot.com. This is part of my watercolor basics series. I hope you guys enjoyed this field test / tutorial. I hope you learned something. I hope you feel inspired to go and create something of your own today or tomorrow, or to take the steps necessary to pursuing a goal that you're excited about. I hope you guys have a really wonderful day. I hope you get some positive encouragement today about something you did personally. That always means a lot. I try to give you guys encouragement, but I know it's kind of more generalized encouragement since we don't necessarily know each other. But we're getting to know each other through YouTube, and that's cool too. So if you enjoyed this video, if you would like to do me a favor, please hit like. It lets YouTube know that you like this video, of course. It improves my rankings, so more people will be introduced to my work through their organic recommendation system. Please subscribe for more content like this. Your subscribing and your watch time, so when you watch the whole video, even these long-winded tutorials, your watch time also determines where my work falls in the rankings. So I appreciate those of you who sat through the very end, hung out with me for as long as it took to paint this. If you'd like to help me out, if you'd like to say a little thanks for doing this, please share this video to your social networks. Even people who do not create art themselves often find it relaxing or enjoyable to watch someone else create art. For some people, it triggers an ASMR response. So if you know of somebody who might enjoy this video for that reason, please share it with them. There are social network sharing buttons underneath this video. Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, no, I keep saying Instagram, but not Instagram. Facebook, Pinterest, Google+. All of those are excellent places, and they would help me out a lot if you took a moment to share them there. If you have any questions or comments, any concerns, any techniques or things you'd like demonstrated in more detail, please leave me a comment or send me an email, or hey, message me on Twitter and we can start a conversation. If you would like to help fund more content like this, because this can get expensive, please head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup to find out how you can join my community of art nerds who are helping me make content like this twice a week, every week. And if you want more, please head over to natosoup.blogspot.com for 7 years worth of reviews, tutorials, demonstrations, process posts, explanations, all sorts of good stuff to set you on the road to comics or the road to illustration. So I hope you guys, as I said, have a great day. I'm Becca Hilburn. Thank you so much for hanging out with me.